Canada is sailing through a sea of federal debt, around $761 billion, an almost unfathomable number. That's up from $688 billion when Prime Minister Trudeau first took office back in 2015. When voters head to the polls this fall, the Trudeau government will have added at least $73 billion to Ottawa's debt, compared to their promise during the last election that they would add no more than $20 billion. The Liberals added $24.7 billion to the federal debt in the 2017-2018 fiscal year alone. While the figure in real dollar terms is high, let's put that in perspective. Many economists argue that actual deficits in debt are not what we should focus on. Instead, what they say is important is the size of the federal debt relative to the size of our national economy, the debt to GDP ratio. Canada's total government net debt to GDP ratio stood at 27.7% in 2018, according to the International Monetary Fund. This is the lowest among G7 countries, which the IMF estimates will record an average net debt of 86%. In the UK, the ratio was 78% in 2018, and in the US, it was 77.7%.
We've got one of the best debt ratios of the industrial world. And we are going into a world in which there has to be massive investment to be able to compete.
When compared to our national economy, Canada's debt load seems manageable. But when you look at the federal debt load per person, things don't look as rosy. Charles Lemon and Hugh McIntyre measured the total percentage change in debt per person in 2017 dollars for every prime minister since Confederation. By adjusting for inflation and population growth, they can compare the debt legacies by prime ministers over a period of time. This graph shows the federal debt per person at the end of each prime minister's first term, from 1870 to the projections for 2019. The debt per person increased significantly during the first two world wars. It rose from $6,423 per person in 1938 to $23,666 in 1945. After the war, it dipped, but the debt per person steadily grew from $10,317 in 1966 to a historic peak of $35,631 in 1995, a growth of 245%.
Is in the early 1960s when we start to accumulate debt irrespective of military conflict or recession. And it is a fairly straight line from, again, the mid-1960s all the way up to really the middle of the 1990s, when finally the Chrétien Liberal government gets a hold of our budget deficit, starts to pay down debt.
The fiscal reforms brought in under Prime Minister Chrétien in the 1990s initiated a period of debt reduction until 2007. The debt had fallen to $24,260 per person. But after the financial crisis of 2008 and after Prime Minister Trudeau was elected in 2015, it is expected to reach $30,195 by 2019, higher than the 2007 level, but lower than the peak during 1995. Of the 23 prime ministers, how did Mr. Trudeau fare? According to the analysis by Lemon and McIntyre, Trudeau is expected to have added the most to the federal debt during a time without a world war or an economic downturn. His record closely tied to Sir Mackenzie Bowell, and behind him, Sir John Abbott, who both served in the late 19th century.
I'm quite concerned, regardless of who gets elected in the fall, about the fact that we have roughly a $20 billion deficit at a time when we have fairly low unemployment, the economy is growing, albeit slowly, and we have lots of risks on the horizon.
So what is the path back from perennial deficit? Jean Chrétien's government had to take drastic steps to get back into the black. In June of 1994, Moody's Investor Service lowered its AAA rating of Canada's foreign currency debt, citing the government's large and growing public debt. And in early 1995, a scathing editorial in the Wall Street Journal called Canada an honorary member of the Third World.
At that time, we were spending 36 cents out of every dollar on servicing debt interest. When you think about that, that's 36 cents out of every dollar that wasn't going to healthcare, that wasn't going to education, that wasn't going to build a better future for our children.
With its 1995 budget, the Chrétien government's goal was to reduce the overall deficit by 3% of GDP over 3 years. It involved a major restructuring of spending, including transfers to the provinces and unemployment insurance. In a rare show of unity outside wartime, the opposition Reform Party backed the spending cuts.
I think that what made the difference in our case is that we went across the country a year before with the 95 budget, and we explained to Canadians what we were doing. And we made it very clear to them that the purpose of all of this was not simply to clean up the balance sheet, but it was to preserve our social programs, to preserve health care.
The plan worked and resulted in a turnaround of debt dynamics for the next decade until the financial crisis of 2008. The Conservative government of Stephen Harper remained in power after the October 2008 federal election. During the campaign, the Conservatives promised to keep the federal budget in balance, and in its November fiscal update, outlined measures to avoid going into deficit, including eliminating the $28 million subsidy to political parties.
There will be no free ride for political parties.
After the opposition parties attempted to form a coalition government in response, the Conservatives changed course and introduced a budget in January 2009 that included a 2-year stimulus program, mainly focusing on infrastructure spending and that famous gazebo in Huntsville.
Best first-time budget ever by a finance minister.
The Harper government's deficit spending lasted 5 years, with the government coming close to balancing the budget in 2015.
We will balance the budget in 2019.
Just a few months after being elected, it was clear the Trudeau Liberals would break their promise of modest deficits of $10 billion. It soon ballooned to $30 billion. And by the next election, estimates are that $73 billion will have been added to Canada's public debt.
We're showing that the track towards getting to a balanced budget requires a growth track that is higher than we're on today.
So what will it take to get the budget back to balance? The 2018 Fall Economic Update projected the deficit for the current fiscal year would come in at $19.6 billion. The concern for some economists is that the government is dipping into deficit spending, even when the economy is doing well, currently projected to grow by 2%. What happens if the economy hits a slump?
The current government, I think it's safe to say, has really benefited from an economic mini boom of sorts. That seems to be coming to an end. 2019 will probably be a little bit more of a challenging backdrop, and so it'll be really interesting to see where the priorities are and how the government handles spending when they're not getting that lift from the economy that they've enjoyed in past years.
The government's policy of trying to maintain or decline debt relative to the size of the economy will be thrown off the rails if we have a recession.
With an election looming, most governments are tempted to go back to the cookie jar. The finance minister has hinted that skills training will be the focus of his next budget. Bill Morneau has also talked about dealing with the issue of affordable housing for millennials. Any of those promises could come with a hefty price tag.
What kind of value are we getting? Are these projects that are going to enhance Canada's long-term growth, long-term prosperity? Or are they, more boutique measures, things aimed more at, say, getting votes?
Is deficit spending the new normal? Canadians will decide in October which captain will steer the fiscal ship of state. Whoever they choose will navigate Canada's course through a sea of deficit spending or back toward balanced budget waters.